we're going to go now to Romans chapter 11, because Paul wants to, as Paul talks about the ecclesia being this incredibly new phenomenon whereby Gentiles could find and have reconciliation with the God, the Creator, and it was an incredible blessing to the world in fulfillment of a lot of prophecy. He wanted to make sure that Gentiles were also aware of the fact that this did not mean that God has forsaken or cast away or done away with the nation of Israel. And so in Romans, he finishes this whole teaching on a very important topic, and that is a warning to Gentiles. So let's go to Romans chapter 11. Chapter 11 of Romans. Could someone read verses 16 through 24 for us?
If the first fruit is holy, so is the lump. If the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the root and of the richness of the olive tree, don't boast over the branches. But if you boast, it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. True, by their unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by your faith. Don't be conceited, but fear. For if God didn't spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. See then the goodness and severity of God. Toward those who fail, severity, but toward you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise you also will be cut off. They also, if they don't continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of that which is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted, contrary to nature, into a good olive tree, how much more will these, which are the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree?
You know, I'm a big proponent of the notion, because I believe that in the overall counsel of Scripture, it's there, of eternal security, or some of us know it as once saved, always saved. I really am a true believer that once we are his, we're always his, and we can't lose the position of being his. However, having said that, there are a few passages in Scripture that make you scratch your head over, is that a solid position to be? This is one of those. And so this doesn't move me off of that belief, but it does make me pause for a second and wonder, and just ask myself, do I have assurance that that's the right place to be? Again, because this isn't the only passage that alludes to this idea that you might want to just double check, really think through this idea of eternal security. Take a look at verse 16. If the first piece of dough be holy, the lump is also, and if the root be holy, the branches are too. We're gonna look at the root of this cultivated olive tree as being the covenants that Yahweh has made, primarily the Abrahamic covenant. Verse 17, but if some of the branches were broken off. So Paul says that at some point with this cultivated olive tree, the root stemming from the earth and then producing a tree of branches, Paul tells us that some of these branches were cut off, were broken off, were removed from this tree. And Paul goes on to say this, verse 17, so he's addressing the second person here in his letter, being a wild olive branch. In other words, a branch from another tree that's not even related to this root that's created these branches that were broken off. If you, being a wild olive branch, were taken from that wild or olive tree and grafted in among them, well, among who? Among the branches that weren't broken off. Only some of the branches were broken off, not all of them. So this wild olive branch is grafted in among the other branches that aren't broken off into this root that's a cultivated root, and became a partaker, sharer, co-heir, with them of the rich root of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. Now, let's see if we can maybe figure out who are the natural branches. I mean, what's Paul getting at? What is the metaphor for these natural branches of this wild olive tree? Israel, yeah. Okay, good. What about this wild? Gentiles. Good, okay, good. Now, so in verse 17, if some of the natural branches were broken off, that would lead us, the logical deduction would be that not all of the branches are broken off, right? There's still a remnant according to grace. This is ethnic Israel that knows her Messiah, that didn't reject the Messiah. Verse 17, and so Paul is speaking to the Roman congregation as Gentiles, you guys, Gentiles, Gentile believers, if you, being a wild olive branch, were grafted in among ethnic Israel and partake now with all of these covenants that Yahweh has made to ethnic Israel. And the rich root, this root is, if it's the Abrahamic covenant and then, going on into all of these other unconditional covenants that are made to Israel, it is a rich root. I mean, it's the very essence of our identity and all the promises and all the hope that we have. Now listen what Paul's warning is. This is important. Paul's warning to these Gentile believers in verse 18. How are Gentiles a partaker? What does that mean they're a partaker? This is also borne out in a passage we've been reading a lot the last few weeks, and that's Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians 2 verses 11 through 13 say this, and this is Paul speaking to Gentile believers. He says, "Therefore remember that you Gentiles who are called uncircumcised by the circumcised," Paul says that remember you Gentiles were at that time, before the coming of Messiah and his atoning work, you were excluded from Israel, separate from this Messiah, and strangers to the covenants of the promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Paul's saying that outside of these covenants that were for Israel, not for Gentiles, you had zero hope. And so now I think that verse 17, when Paul talks about Gentiles becoming partakers, I think he's saying now you have this unbelievable privilege that was heretofore unknown or unavailable to you to share in these covenants made with Israel. Now, so the important point we'll need to illustrate here, Gentiles are to be partakers, not overtakers. And what has happened in church history is the church and Gentiles have become overtakers and actually have created a demonic doctrine that the church has replaced the tree. So let's go to this warning that Paul gives us about that very teaching. Don't be arrogant toward the branches. Paul's speaking to Gentiles, and he's speaking to those who are still ethnic Israel that have not been broken off. He says here in this warning in verse 18, if you are arrogant, so there's a conditional statement here. Remember, it's not you who supports the root. These covenants aren't made with the ecclesia. These covenants are made with national Israel. Verse 19. You will say then, these Gentile believers, wow, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That's a conclusion that Gentiles believers might make. And Paul says, verse 21, that's right. He has taught this whole time that one of the unbelievable, these confounding plans of the Creator was that Messiah would actually be rejected by Israel, all of Israel, no, not all of Israel, but the leadership specifically and a good portion of Israel, so that the end result might be that Gentiles might come in. All Gentiles? No, not all Gentiles, but those, they at least have the opportunity, and those who want to accept the free gift can. Verse 20, yes, that's right. They were broken off. Now, question relating to this verse is, why were the natural branches broken off? Verse 20 is the answer. Because of their unbelief, and specifically their unbelief in the Messiah. But, verse 20, you stand by your faith. Faith in what? Not the Mosaic law, but Messiah Yeshua. Gentiles now have standing as partakers in all of these covenants made with Israel, only through their faith in the Messiah. Now, check out this last clause in verse 20. As a result of this unbelievable event in history, what should your state be as a believing Gentile?
Don't be high-minded.
But
Fear.
you should be afraid. Paul's teaching, we're not to be afraid of God. We have healthy self-esteem. With regard to this attitude that you have towards the nation of Israel, you better be afraid. You better be afraid. That's what Paul's teaching. What should I be afraid of? Being conceited, arrogant, churchy. We're the chosen frozen. Be very, very afraid of that teaching, of that attitude, of that contemptuous place to be where you are nothing, only sharing because of pure grace. Verse 21 says this. Now, this is why this is a challenge to my notions and a lot of our notions, strong notions of eternal security. Here comes the challenge. Verse 21. If God didn't spare the natural branches, and by the way, we've been teaching that election belongs to Israel. Israel is the elect nation, but nonetheless, there are parts of Israel that were broken off despite their election. Because they were busted off that tree. They didn't want to come off that tree. The gardener busted them off and dumped them probably where the prunes stuff goes, in a big old bonfire. If God did not spare the elect, what's the end of verse 21 say? If you're conceited with regard to your new relationship to the God of Israel, you should be afraid. If he did that to his elect, what do you think he's going to do to a dirty Gentile like you that has that attitude? Maybe he'll bust you off and throw you in the bonfire. So does this mean that you can lose your salvation? I still think no, but wow. This is, and there's not, this isn't the only passage that alludes to this idea that, you can lose it. But this is one of the passages that you can build a strong case for the fact that it's not eternal. You don't have eternal security. You can lose it. That's what Paul's saying. What did the unbelief in verse 20 relate to? The natural branch, the elect, right? What is neither will he spare you refer to? That unbelief in verse 20? No, it refers to the conceit in verse 20. It doesn't refer to the unbelief. The natural branches were broken off for unbelief. They weren't spared. Paul says, what is it that could cause you to not be spared? I don't think it's unbelief in this scripture, in this passage. I think it's conceit. So this is a real warning to take to heart. Yep. This is about a high and mighty attitude toward the Jews. It's not just being unspiritual. It's not being unbelieving. It's about if you're arrogant towards Jewish people, towards Israel, you're in real trouble. You are in real trouble. So yeah, you can spiritualize this all you want. But look at what the text is telling us with regard to the specific instruction and the specific warning. Don't get uppity, a specific kind of uppity. Well, don't be unhumble. Yeah, that's always a good spiritual, nice homily. Don't be arrogant. But Paul's saying you might not be spared if you're arrogant towards Israel. That's the specific teaching right here. Let's take a look at verse 21. For if God didn't spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Now that's a real serious warning. Verse 22, behold then two things. So Paul's saying now in verse 22, get a hold of both of these ideas. The kindness, we're all familiar with the kindness. That's good. He is kind. And I think that's why Paul says it first. But also what? The severity. He's not messing with us. He's not playing church. He wants your life, your time, your identity, your ambitions. You're the one that said you wanted to be a disciple. Now, he's not messing about it. And whom he loves, he disciplines. And he'll put a whoop on those he loves that will make them think again. So he says here, so behold, verse 22, both the grace, the kindness, but also the severity to those who fell. Now he's talking to unbelieving Israel. Severity, they got broken off. But to you, Gentiles who believe, pure kindness. Here's the conditional statement. If, only if you continue in your kindness. And I believe if you go back to what Paul was talking about in verse 20 with regard to Israel, this idea of conceit. If you continue in your kindness, otherwise what? You'll be cut off. And he's speaking to Gentile believers. Wow. Scary. Scary, scary, scary. Verse 23. And they also, if they do not continue on their, well, these ones that were broken off, they could be grafted back in. For God is able to graft them in again, and Paul teaches that all Israel will be saved. In other words, even unbelieving Israel at some point in the future will be grafted, will be added back to the olive tree. Verse 24. For if you were cut off what is by nature a wild olive tree and were grafted in contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more shall these who are the natural branches be grafted into their... So Paul's ending argument is that all Israel will be saved. Now, I think I get a lot of questions sometimes on this teaching. Does that mean if you die without knowing Messiah and you're Jewish, you're going to be saved? No, it doesn't mean that. Because the whole first portion of Romans is about this idea that your righteousness is only derived from one place, and that's faith in the Jewish Messiah. If you're Jew or Gentile and you don't have faith in that Jewish Messiah, you're done. It's over. You're appointed once to die and then the judgment. This is a warning that we want to talk about with regard to a teaching on the ecclesia, because it is something that the historic church has really, really gone far off of. Even our healthy evangelical churches today are drinking from the poison of this well still to some degree. And we've got to be careful of it.